Hello. Hi, everyone. It's so good to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us on a very close, intimate discussion that we're going to be having on tech facilitated gender-based violence during moments of transition and conflict. And so, just briefly introducing myself, I'm Mona Tajali. I describe myself as a scholar of gender and politics, and this discussion is part of the course that I'm teaching at Stanford University within the program on feminist gender and sexuality studies. The course is titled "What is Gender-Based Violence? Politics and Politics, Policies and Politics of Recognition and Prevention." I know it's a mouthful, but I really wanted us for this course to be more recognizing sort of some of the gaps in policies that we have and how sort of feminist literature and law and public policy have sort of been grappling with these issues. So the topic that we're discussing, obviously, we know that conflicts or moments of transition are never gender neutral. We have periods of war, political upheaval, and transition that often deepen very existing inequalities that exist. And they particularly expose women, marginalized communities, historically marginalized, whether it's across race, across gender, across ethnicity, across religion, and they actually expose them to heightened risks of violence. They're also quite fragile moments. These are the structures that can be quite disrupted. This is where power can be negotiated during moments of conflict. And this is when institutions, and by institutions, I mean law, policies, the judiciary, the police enforcement, and so on and so forth. This is when those can also be quite tested. And of course, public trust can become really affected. What we're seeing increasingly is that these dynamics that we see that take place with political conflict and sort of moments of transition, while they're happening in real time in sort of the political space, many times such dynamics also spill into what we call the digital spaces. So moments of instability, for instance, can intensify digital surveillance and repression. This is something that we've been seeing across much of I would say across the globe, but particularly, for instance, in a country that right now is in the midst of war in Iran, where surveillance has been used to particularly target women's rights activists, to particularly target any type of group or movement or organizing that tries to challenge the status quo, and that status quo is usually sort of the patriarchal status quo. Also, you see where acceleration of misinformation and disinformation can take place, including polarization can take place, where sometimes also with the rise of AI, you have deep fakes and all of that. And so all of this leads to what we call sort of the undermining of democratic principles, undermining egalitarianism, gender equality gains. And we see some of the many important gains that the feminist movement particularly made in terms of recognizing violence, recognizing GBV. Once it comes into the digital sphere, then it becomes very difficult to really recognize how to deal with it, right? So it seems as though if someone walks up to you and just like slaps you, becomes much more real than if someone, does something on the digital space. So technology, what we know is that does not exist outside of political realities. It reflects and amplifies them. And as conflicts shape power, security, and the civic space, they also reshape the digital terrain with long-term implications for rights, safety, and participation. And again, for our context is that we know all of these dynamics impact democracy here in the United States. We are seeing that the rise of social media use, the rise of basically the limited access to free media and all of that has been major factors in the decline or the backlash of democracy that we've been seeing. And so all of these go hand in hand. Obviously, gender and gender equality are sort of part and parcel of all of these things. So I look forward to unpacking these sort of intersections with our esteemed experts and explore how we can respond thoughtfully and effectively, particularly what it means for democratic participation. So I'm going to start with just very brief introduction of the first speaker, and then I will, after her remarks, I will go ahead and introduce our second speaker. So we have Anwar Marjan, who's a native of Al-Fahm, which is a city composed of Arab Palestinians in the Haifa district of Israel. She is an associate professor of political science and international studies at Stonehill College and currently a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Center for Middle Eastern Studies for this academic year. So I'm really hoping that you're having an exceptionally productive time there. Professor Marjan's research focuses on feminist security studies, critical cybersecurity, disinformation, and Middle Eastern politics. She serves on the Academic Council of American Friends of Companions for Peace and the Board of Americans Academics for Equality. She's the co-editor of Critical Perspectives on Cybersecurity, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2024. Her writings have been featured across many academic as well as popular outlets, including Global Studies Quarterly, Journal of Human Rights, Journal of Genocide Research, Journal of Women, Politics and Policy, International Feminist Journal of Politics, and many, many others. She also writes for media and policy outlets such as Binding Hook, which was the piece that you all read from, was from that outlet, as well as World Politics Review, Foreign Policy, The Conversation, The Times of Israel, Haaretz, Middle East Eye, and many others. In addition to her cutting-edge research, Dr. Marjan has also been consulting various global, regional, and national entities on concerns such as cybersecurity, gendered dis or misinformation, and TFGBV. We're extremely fortunate to have the opportunity to hear from her, especially at a time when the conflicts of our region are expanding with real gendered implications for both our online and offline spaces. I will go ahead and give you the floor.
Thank you. That was not a brief introduction. Thank you for inviting me to talk to your students. This topic, has been more and more prominent on the news as we see. I don't know if the students paid attention to what was happening with Grok, which is X's AI, excuse me. And the fact that it was producing pornographic photos of anybody online, including children, of course, women. Statistically, we see that the majority of people who experience gender-based violence and like sexual motivated gender-based violence online are women. Now, to highlight that, it's important to say that this violence is present in multiple spaces, in online spaces as well as in physical spaces. And what happens is that the online spaces reflect what is going on in physical spaces, and they get amplified with obviously broader consequences that I am going to discuss. So what is happening in the digital sphere right now, we see a rise in movements across the globe, populist, patriarchal movements, that even though they come from different regions, they share a lot in common when it comes to gender issues and their views on women, family, traditional households, the LGBTQI plus communities. So if you talk to an Islamist, probably in the Middle East, as well, like as an alt-right activist who is part of the manosphere, they will share similar views in a lot of cases on gendered roles, sexuality, etc. And that creates networks of patriarchy, right, that exist across continents and can learn from each other. They don't have to necessarily directly collaborate or cooperate, but they definitely learn from each other. And that, I don't know if you guys discussed one of the manosphere. Is that a concept that you've brought up in the class? Bueno.
Yes, you're
Yeah.
correct. I'm sorry about that. We're having a little bit of a sound in the room issue, but yeah, we're gonna figure it out.
Are
But
they
I'm
able to
glad
hear me
that
okay?
if you could speak a tiny bit louder, for some reason the sound is only coming out of my laptop instead of the room's speakers. So we're trying to figure that out.
Could you connect to the
Okay, let me get
Thank you.
my laptop closer.
maybe
Is
my
it better now?
Yes.
Okay. So anyways, I was discussing kind of how the network, the cyber element, the digital sphere has amplified existing patriarchal dynamics and how it kind of connects and links different patriarchal groups across ideological divides. Like, let's say, I don't know, an Islamist in the Middle East versus somebody who's on the alt-right here in the US. And it seems like What we're seeing now with AI is becoming even worse because it's easier for people to produce content that target anybody with disinformation. We know now it's disinformation is rampant, disinformation and misinformation. I don't know if we need to define the terms. I don't know if you guys discussed it, but just kind of to establish a basis for that. Usually, the classic definition of disinformation is kind of false information that is produced intentionally for a purpose, for a political, usually a political reason. There's an idea, like there's a goal behind it. And then we have misinformation. The way I like to explain it is like your grandma retweeting something or like, sharing something on Facebook that is not true, but she doesn't know that it's not true. And that's the classic definition of that. Now, I focus on a different subset of that, which is gender disinformation. Now, gender disinformation is specifically targeting women activists, feminist activists, public figures, who, with the goal of kind of undermining them, silencing them, and trying to prevent others from participating in that sphere. Now, I'm trying to push us to think more beyond just one element of gender disinformation, to think about false information about gender and sexuality and the feminist movement in general. So the micro would be gender disinformation against female activists, and the macro would be discussing how gender as a narrative, LGBTQI plus rights, the feminist movements, patriarchal values are being used as an umbrella for authoritarian governance by multiple actors that includes state plus non-state actors who agree a lot on kind of what they assume the best way to shape society through the traditional family unit. That usually means, a man and a wife, with the wife having more duties in the home. And then that's where we see also the over sexualization, the patriarchal views being present. And here we see a lot of authoritarian actors endorsing that, not necessarily maybe because they care about the issue, but because if they disagree, if a group in society disagrees with their policies over, I don't know, economics, etc., they will agree over traditional values and kind of that family structure and anti-LGBTQI plus sentiments, etc. I'll bring up also more examples about the macro. Like it got to the level where disinformation about gender itself, like what does the word gender mean? What are these international agreements like the Istanbul Convention mean to society itself, have resulted in countries in the Middle East like Iraq not to use the term gender, in Turkey to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention that was actually like agreed upon in Istanbul. That's where it got that shortcut name. And it has amplified voices within society and helped a lot of authoritarian actors gain support and momentum, that starts online, but of course also translates into political power throughout the region. So kind of types of micro level gender disinformation, sexualized rumors. If you call somebody, for instance, excuse me for the language I'm going to use, like a slut or whatever, that's is that an insult or disinformation? If it comes with what you produce as an evidence of that behavior, then that's where the disinformation element comes into play. Producing fake intimate images, deep fake porn, accusations of kind of being controlled by foreign powers, by the West. There's a lot of people who use the term, so George Soros is actually another common thing that people use in the Middle East that is also used across the West as well in these circles. And a lot of kind of the claim that these women are anti religion, they're attacking the religion, the culture, with the goal of destroying it and bringing Western values. So the goal here is not to persuade, a political agenda, is to discredit these activists and silence them. This mainly targets women journalists, politicians, feminist academics, human rights defenders. Of course, you can use a deepfake against a high school girl and that will ruin her life, as we've seen in context in the West and outside of the West. Even in Massachusetts, there was a case at the high school where a girl suffered severe mental stress because of the presence of a deepfake porn video of her online. But these are important dynamics, but we're examining it at the political level where there are actually wider political implications, and there's a reason behind it that goes beyond just hurting one person. It's more about kind of creating an environment of threat and silence to promote political power. Um, we see actually like there are lots of examples from Italy. It targets female activists across the spectrum, the political spectrum, whether conservatives or not. But we see more severe consequences in cultures where, you know, a rumor or a deep fake could not only cause you mental and emotional discomfort, it could actually cause you know, family members, the society to flip against you and actually could cause physical harm. Um, okay, so how much time did I take too much time? I still have a lot. Other stuff that I think are important.
Another, let's say another 7 minutes.
Okay, that's not bad. um, Other things, you know, a lot of people say, how can we measure this? And it has been actually very difficult to measure the impact of gender disinformation and disinformation or fake false information about gender and feminist issues related to feminist advocacy, because one, it's similar to a lot of the GBV issues where reporting is not that common. Women don't talk about it much. The data is still like emerging and scarce. A lot of people didn't even pay attention to it initially. And even when I look at fact checking organizations across the region, it seems like they don't pay enough attention to the issue of women and gender. There was an instance where in Sudan, an organization that works from Morocco did an analysis on gender disinformation in Sudan. And the way they viewed it was actually interesting. It was a different dynamic where women and children are being used as a way to discredit one side. So attacks against women and children. A lot of these images, of course, were false, taken from multiple contexts. There are attacks against women and children. I'm not going to say that. Obviously, Sudan has a very severe humanitarian situation that has been described as a genocide and sexual violence, etc. But a lot of the images were false. Not that the sexual violence was happening; it's the images that were used to describe that were false, and of course that has consequences because then you could discredit legitimate reports of sexual violence as false, which is the flip coin of that is you stop trusting information and calling it fake news, which discredits victims, you know, in multiple locations around the world, especially during times of conflict. The idea here is that, you know, it's a complicated environment. The reporting is we need more data to understand that and pay attention to it. The majority of my work has been on kind of finding reports in journal in kind of newspapers, talking to locals about cases. And I found one of the other things is a lot of women don't know that you could define this as gender disinformation, so they don't know how to report it, right? I spoke to a Syrian activist a while back, and I was telling her how you define gender disinformation. She's like, "Oh my God, that happened to me. That happened to me." And the fact that people don't even have the language to describe this experience makes it harder to collect data on the issue. Um, Other kind of narratives when we move from the micro to the macro, which is like disinformation about the feminist movements, women's rights, gender equality initiatives, etc. One, it frames gender equality as chaos, ruining society, the family structure, a Western intervention, turns women's rights into a moral panic. So the moral panic is an important thing. Creating a sense of crisis is important for maintaining authoritarian forces. And then they position feminists as a civilizational threat, and that way you can mobilize people. And it is important to say that gender disinformation is an element of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, which Professor Tajali, I'm sure, discussed with you. It's just a subset of it. And I like to view it as, or I'm trying to argue that it is an important tactic of digital authoritarianism. Now we have authoritarianism, which is authoritarian regimes with structures, the military, the physical force, etc. And then we have digital authoritarianism, which pays attention to how social media, the digital sphere has enabled authoritarian actors to maintain the authoritarian structures and maintain their power without having to kill as many people or put as many people in prison. So one of them is, of course, through surveillance, like Pegasus is a big example. Two, it's through controlling the information environment and shaping what's being discussed online and who's being targeted and delegitimized online. And that's what digital authoritarianism is. It's making it less costly to be authoritarian. And we see that like across multiple cases. Again, I'm discussing authoritarian regimes, but I like to think about it as a trend that exists among authoritarian actors. These are actors that do believe in that centralized force, the traditional values, and oppose kind of movements, liberal movements, and feminist movements, and any differences. Um, Okay, so another kind of important thing to cover before this is that feminists have covered gender as like a tactic of authoritarian structures long time ago, but it's the time now to kind of bring it out to the cyber digital realm. We see more work emerging on that field. In that field, we need more work on AI and its impact, of course, as you guys in Silicon Valley love to talk about AI. But the impacts and harms haven't been discussed enough. A lot of companies in Silicon Valley have been contributing more and more to the problems in the Middle East. The reason why I started looking at gender disinformation is because Meta reached out to me asking me about a case. It was an Iraqi activist that was targeted online, accused of again being, slutty, blah, blah, blah. You can insert the words. And she was attacked online, and they're like, should we delete the post? And I'm like, yes, like you definitely should delete the post, right? Because in order to understand the implications of this post, where in the West, maybe you need a pornographic video, a false pornographic video to take it down. In the Middle East, it's different. Like, let's say you're in Saudi Arabia and there is a picture of you, I don't know, like wearing a bikini or without the veil that comes up. Maybe for the Western audience, that's like, okay, it's not a big deal. But for these women that come from these conservative societies, that's a big deal. And if you read my piece, I mentioned in Pakistan, there were cases where like women were discredited, like just for hugging somebody. So it is kind of the idea in the West of like let's move away from content moderation, freedom of speech, the whole Zuckerberg argument that the EU is interfering in what they're doing and it's kind of impending on the freedom of speech is creating a lot of problems in these regions. A lot of the initiatives in Silicon Valley do not pay attention to local languages and what's happening there or have the cultural understanding of the implications of that. And the amount of power that they have. So yeah, I'm going to end it here with kind of like the question of what responsibility do companies in Silicon Valley, since you guys are in Stanford, hold, and how can we navigate that in a context where we're moving more and more towards deregulation, claims that these companies can do whatever in the name of innovation and collecting data as much as possible on anyone, anytime. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. This gave us a very, very good overview of all the very major important topics, as well as sort of your definition of digital authoritarianism and sort of like breaking it down for us that it becomes a very effective tool to maintain control and to sort of decrease the cost onto those authoritarian forces. But we also know that authoritarianism goes very much hand in hand with sort of gender inequality. So it completely makes sense that there's a gendered component that oftentimes many of us sort of take that for granted, right? Like unless you're a feminist advocate, arguing for this, it's lost on many of our policymakers. And yes, I loved your question at the end because this is what we're going to be picking up. I also would like to add sort of a slight extension to that question to say, what would a feminist intervention look like on behalf of sort of Silicon Valley and sort of the big tech in terms of addressing some of these, recognizing that context specific components sort of play into it, and sort of the role of local actors is also very significant. Okay, thank you. So our next speaker is Cecilia Riederer, is a senior project manager at Better Politics Foundation, which is a Berlin-based organization that seeks to cultivate democratic politics from the bottom up. During her tenure, Cecilia has been dedicated to strengthening democratic spaces and political leadership through collaboration, training, and inclusive leadership. In her current role, Cecilia leads the global programs focused on strengthening political leadership and addressing structural barriers to representation and safety in politics. So something that is very close to, as well, as you all know, to also what I hold close to my heart, which is increasing women's political presence, particularly minority as well as other minority groups' political presence and access to sort of political decision-making roles. Her role spans strategy, partnership development, and portfolio oversight across multi-country initiatives, including in several Muslim-majority contexts, such as Indonesia, where, as I mentioned, we met in December at a Women Living Under Muslim Laws convening in Yogyakarta. And of course, in Bangladesh, where she has conducted trainings of women political candidates on online safety and security, a country that, again, Women Living Under Muslim Laws is also involved in, especially with regards to TFGBV. In addition to project management, she's devoted to stakeholder engagement in the civil society space and in political campaigns. Her thematic expertise includes online violence against politicians, social and political norms, disability rights, and gender equality. Cecilia also currently hosts the podcast Social Norms Chat. I highly, highly encourage you all to check out Better Politics Foundation's website. I'm so glad to know of the important work they do, and as well the repository that that Better Politics Foundation has been sort of putting together in collaboration with others on sort of some of the policies on gendered violence. Okay, Cecilia, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I don't think I've ever been introduced this much, so thank you for that. Let me try and share some slides just to show some visuals as well. As a practitioner in the room, I always like to be the one with some visuals. So let me know if you can see this in full screen. Yeah?
Yes, I can see it. Thank
Great.
you.
Perfect. Yes, so as was mentioned, I work at Better Politics Foundation, which is a kind of globally operating but non-partisan organization that wants to reimagine political leadership for the 21st and maybe the 22nd century, actually. And so we do this kind of in three ways, just to kind of give everyone an idea as to what we do. We support around 120 organizations around the world who support candidates and people who want to go into political leadership and who want to run for office in different ways. We do a lot of work around innovation in politics, and we kind of think about broader storytelling. How do we talk differently about politics and politicians, and what kind of systems change is needed to actually create kind of a work environment and a political system that enables good political leadership. And kind of the reason why we need to do this is that we are essentially stuck in almost every single country in the world, probably in everyone, in some sort of crisis where the politics of today are very much kind of an 18th century construct and understanding of politics within institutions that are mirrored after a 19th century vision of political institutions, using, sadly, primarily kind of technology from the past century and kind of a mindset and representation of that, while, of course, the world is facing problems that are very much future-looking. Everything from AI regulation that we already mentioned to climate change to poverty reduction are really problems that are a lot bigger than our politics can currently handle. And so all of this really leads to a crisis of trust. Everywhere we look, we're seeing trust in politics, trust in democracy, trust in politicians declining. And what this has really led to in the past decades is a movement, kind of a decade of movements and protests. Everything from the Gen Z protests in Kenya 2 years ago to the Bangladesh protests in 2024, which actually brought down the regime. We're seeing protests in Iran. We're seeing really protests all over the world, almost all the time. These are just the marked protests in the past kind of couple of years that were more than 10,000 people at a time. And already, essentially every country in the world, except for a handful, are kind of lit up and have faced protests and kind of movements showing that there is increased dissatisfaction by citizens. And I guess for us, the biggest question for this, and this is a question I would love to ask in the room, and maybe Mona, you can help me by telling me how people like vote, is the question that I would love to ask is how many of you would ever consider running for political office, whether that's kind of at a local level or say for president all the way up, but it can be just kind of local council in whatever country you feel most kind of associated with. And maybe the ones online can raise their hand if they would run for office. Okay, I have one person online. Mona, anyone in person who wants to run for office?
I'm encouraging them to speak. Yeah. Feel free to unmute and speak.
Not, I have a not me. Yeah. I think this is kind of the point. Thank you for making my point for me, right? So one of the biggest problems that we're having is that we are missing political talent. We're missing out on the best and brightest people because no one wants to run for political office. We did a survey globally, and actually 25% of respondents said, okay, yeah, I have run for office or I would consider it. So the world is actually slightly better than the average in this group, but still 25% is not a very good number considering that the people running for office and who actually get elected into political office make decisions for our nations and kind of for the future of our world. And so we would want the kind of best trained, educated, and kind of most fit and kind of benevolent and compassionate leaders, really, to run for office. And so the question then becomes, well, there's a bit of difference here. North America and Europe, unsurprisingly, are the worst here. The least people want to run for office. And there seems to be a lot more hope still in some other regions of the world. But generally speaking, when we then ask people, well, why would you not run for office? They say their responses kind of fall into three buckets. One response is, I don't have the financing to do this. Usually you have to kind of fund your own campaign, and people say, I would love to run, but I can't afford it. That's something that is very structural, that is very hard to tackle. The second biggest reason is people saying, I actually have no idea how to run for office. I wouldn't even know where to begin. That's kind of an information gap, and that's something that can be solved. This is something that we do in our work essentially all the time. This is what most of the 120 plus organizations around the world that we work with do in some way, shape, or form, is provide the information to people who would like to run for office but just don't know how to. But the barrier that I'm most concerned with and that my work focuses on primarily is this third one, which I've titled Violence and Well-Being, which is essentially people saying that I'm not going to run for office because I'm afraid of the violence that I would face, whether that's online violence or physical violence. It's that they're saying, I don't know if I could handle it mentally, my mental well-being, or as a third kind of factor that also counts into the same barrier, I would be afraid for the physical safety and well-being of my family and loved ones. And so all of those together are kind of the biggest barrier that people name when they are asked, why are you not running for politics or kind of a political office? And so in the past couple of years, we've done some research into this topic. And one of our research projects has been on kind of the state of mental well-being of politicians worldwide. And we found that in our study, the rating of mental well-being of politicians was lower than that of police and ambulance drivers. And the data from those two groups was taken during the COVID pandemic. So those are highly stressful jobs during kind of a health crisis, and still politicians have a lower score on average in the world. And if you look at that, at kind of the mental well-being research we did in more depth, one of the biggest drivers of that low mental well-being is violence. So we're coming back to violence, and especially online violence again and again. And so here are some of the kind of statistics globally on online violence, in this case specifically against women in politics. But importantly, I think online violence is not just a women's issue. Every politician faces violence, what we have found in kind of our research and our assessment of research that has been done is that the difference is not whether you face violence or not as a man or a woman in politics, it's the quality of the hate. So a lot of men will get hateful comments that are about content, about policy, saying, I really hate that you voted on Bill XYZ, right? But for the women, the comments that they will get are sexualized, they're about their body, they're about their appearance. And so they have no content. They're not about politics. They're just about them being a woman. And that's the difference. So it's not even a quantitative difference, it's a qualitative difference in the type of violence. I brought an example. I was recently in Uganda. Uganda had elections in late January, and I was there in early February working with newly elected women MPs. And these are two examples that I wanted to bring just to showcase a bit what we mean when we say. So Yvonne was a presidential candidate. She ran as an independent, and she said online harassment in her case was made up of people essentially saying she was sleeping with the Rwandan president and thus destabilizing the Ugandan government and unfit to run as a president because she was wearing makeup and dressing up. Another example of a young human rights activist who ran as a first-time MP, she campaigned and made a post declaring that she is HIV positive and that she would be the first person who would represent young people in parliament that is HIV positive in Uganda. And this post was reposted by a former vice chancellor of the biggest and most respected university of Uganda, saying, as you can see here, essentially implying that her coming into parliament would be dangerous because all the horny MPs would sleep with her and thus get HIV. So the violence that women face, especially in times of election and kind of political transitions, like here in Uganda, is often implying that they're using sex to get advancements, that they are getting a better position by sleeping with someone, and that they're unfit to run for office because they are a woman. So if you look at the question of like, okay, who does this, right? If you're talking about kind of TFGBV or online violence in politics, especially against politicians, who is actually doing this violence? And I think there are three main buckets that we have identified. And usually you can see like violence coming from all three buckets, but in various kind of combinations. Of course, there are a lot of individuals who do online hate. This can be just random citizens who either have nothing better to do or were radicalized and who now go online and write hateful comments. But it can also be a strategic campaign of an opposing party who send out their people and kind of are rallying them up to go after another politician online. There are organized groups, and I'm glad the Manosphere was already mentioned because this is one of the big kind of organizing groups where you have groups online coordinating attacks, especially against women politicians, and then really going and kind of flooding the comments with hateful messages. This can also be kind of an organized group like the opposition party, and actually sometimes from your own party. Especially women face most violence from within their own political party, from men within the party who don't want them to succeed politically. And then the last kind of group is states. This could be domestic states who are trying to suppress the opposition, and it could be foreign states. We're seeing a lot of foreign interference that uses online violence and disinformation and misinformation in times of elections and political transition and fragility to influence the outcome of that process. Some of the weapons, many of these have already been kind of mentioned, but just to give an overview of some of the really weapons that are used online, especially by individuals and groups, everything from deepfakes and image-based abuse. A lot of this is fake porn that is created. Of course, there is impersonation and catfishing. We've seen this with quite a few candidates where there are AI-created videos impersonating that they are saying something or that they are present somewhere where they've never been before to make them look bad. Doxing, and that's where online violence then really spills over into the real world and leads to physical harm. In terms of institutional weapons, I wanted to mention a couple of kind of prime examples very recently. We've seen a lot of institutions and states use internet and social media shutdowns as a way to really control the internet in times of political transitions. We just saw this in Uganda, we saw it in Tanzania, we've seen it in Iran, where the government turns down the internet and social media to avoid political opposition to organize. We are seeing organized state-led campaigns. In the case of Bangladesh, this was actually a state-led kind of organized campaign by the Indian state trying to interfere in the elections. And we are seeing the weaponization of hate speech law. So you have a government creating a law or regulation to regulate hate speech and to prosecute it, and then they turn it against leaders of the opposition and claim that they are violating free speech laws or violating the hate speech laws, and then end up prosecuting them. There were cases of this as well in Bangladesh before the 2024 uprising. And then, so maybe is a question of kind of what can we actually do? The way we really think about this is in terms of offense and defense, because this is a war. If you look online, and I'm sure many of you have this in your own comment sections or in your own DMs, this is not kind of a nice to have a play anymore. It's very much a war online. And so the way we think about this is, what are solutions for individuals? Things like training a politician how to be more secure online, and what are the really collective societal solutions that we can do? Things like laws, regulations, building kind of global partnerships. But there are also tech solutions, mental well-being, kind of strengthening the ecosystem. There are a lot of different things. So this is kind of one of the overviews of everything that could be done. And here are some of the kind of examples that we are doing currently. So we have partnered with the Australian government to implement a social media self-defense training, which is really, how do you defend yourself online? What are some of the things that you as a person online can do to protect yourself? We have an upstander bystander intervention, which we have been piloting in Latin America, where we train people to be internet elves instead of trolls. So when a politician is attacked by a mob, we flood the comment zone with positive messages instead, and we essentially drown out the hate with love. We have partnered with AI startups like Trollwall to do AI-based content moderation on social media. Many politicians receive not a few hate comments every day, but thousands and thousands. So moderating that automatically gets really important. We have the online law repository, which you all read about. We have broader safety trainings, and we have a norms change campaign called Flip the Hate, which tries to humanize politicians and thus kind of end violence at the root cause. And I know my time is up, so I am actually done.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was great. Yay. We're giving you a virtual clap. Okay, great. So we have exactly 15 minutes. So I can have you all raise your hands and ask questions, please. And I will mute so there's no echo. And of course, panelists can ask each other questions as well. And so, did I ask the first question? Okay. All right. So thank you. Thank you so much for that. I have one question for Dr. Marjan, and then I have another question from Cecilia. So you spoke about the sort of you're looking at TFGBV in general at both at the micro level as well as at the macro level. And I wanted to also dig a little bit deeper to ask you with one of the things that Cecilia just ended with was with regards to the perpetrators. When you're looking at the perpetrators within the authoritarian context, can we say that it's sort of holistically the state actors? Is it non-state actors? Is it a combination of the two? And what are some of the sort of best tactics to be able to address it, especially within the context where, again, like, for instance, like within the Iranian context, your internet connection and, all of that is given to you by the state, but yet it's sort of it's seen as like a corporation. So like, what are some of the avenues for redress, if any? And so what is scholarship telling us about all of this? And then for Cecilia's question, I'm really interested in sort of the interventions that you just mentioned. And I really liked sort of the graph that you drew with like the offense and the defense. I wanted to know, like, Better Politics Foundation. I mean, there's only so much one can do, right? So one of the things I feel like, because of the fact that we're also facing sort of a moment of crisis, when it comes to that, sort of so in our course, we've been talking a lot about sort of cultural norms. Cultural norms are, very difficult to change. They're not impossible, but of course we know that cultures are like always changing. So I wanted to get your input on like legal change, maybe another, lack of a better word is like top-down change, policy change, platform change, I don't know, like guidelines versus the norms and behaviors, right? Because some are saying that no, you really need to start at the school age, with little boys and little girls and tell them about respect and gender equality and all that. So I just wanted to know, considering that it is a crisis and we are facing these multiple fronts, sometimes we do, as feminists, we do advocate for going for the lower hanging fruit. Is Better Politics thinking about it in that way? And yeah, what are your ways? Thank you.
I can start since the first question was mine, and it's about actors. The fascinating thing about this, and I used the term authoritarian states as well as authoritarian actors, period, because they don't have to be state actors. They can be, a lot of them are non-state actors. We talk about cyber army, cyber trolls. Actually, I heard a new term in Arabic. It's like cyber flies that will promote the agenda of a state actor. So what happens is, for instance, a politician will tweet something and say, hey, report this, or this person is this and that. And these actors will come and amplify that, retweet, reshare into their own networks. And that's how it's being used. And the cost of entry is very low. Anybody could go in and become part of that, like, army, the cyber army, as some have described it to be. But there are also fake accounts, right? And people who are hired to do this. I mean, Russians are well known for this. Russians have innovated with gender disinformation. That's why the EU are heavily focused on it, especially with like Ukraine and Russia's situation, and also the idea that it's an intervention from West, the feminist values, the family unit, the destructions of that, mocking Ukrainian soldiers as gay, and like how the Russians are like stronger because of that. So we see it's kind of this interaction between state actors and non-state actors and their supporters. They're creating mobs online, right? And that's why sometimes sometimes it's very easy to connect it to state actors because they're tweeting. Like, for instance, and this is not an example of gender disinformation just because it happened that I'm working on it. It's just an example of disinformation where after October 7th, we saw a lot of disinformation being spread around by official state accounts that were amplified across activist groups, right? And we see that also happening, on the other side. Like, I'm not going to say it's just an Israeli issue, but the fascinating thing about this is like the IDF will post that, or like a minister of something, when it's easily, like, if somebody speaks Arabic, they can tell it's a lie, right? It's not even that hard to refute that. So we see, like, these are incidents where it's easy to identify that. But if you're hiring somebody, if like you have a group of supporters that you mobilize online, and like you say in a speech, hey, like this person is this and that, and then that translates into an online campaign. So it's like the fact that it could come from the top and then amplified by the bottom, or it could also be instigated in ways that it seems like it's an organic online campaign, but it's inorganic in a lot of ways.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting that fluidity. And I think I can imagine that because of that fluidity in terms of the actors, also addressing them becomes much more challenging, right? Like, although, so like if it's a state actor, if it's not a state actor, it's someone you employ to be able to do this, or someone, some of the programming that takes place. Thank you. Yes, Cecilia.
Yeah, thank you for asking a very complex question. So, I mean, really, if we think about the norms around online violence, with norms being really kind of the societal permission structure as to what behavior is acceptable or unacceptable within our societies. The reason this gets really complex when we move online is because usually social norms are kind of defined and upheld within bound societies or social groups, often within kind of both locally, but then also within the nation state, which can actually provide laws and regulations to enforce and uphold these norms. The problem online is it's all transnational, which also means that we are being influenced by cultural norms all around the world and not just by the ones kind of close to home. And this really creates a complication when we start thinking about norms change, because we can't just change the norms wherever you are located, because once you go online on TikTok or Instagram or wherever you go, you can be exposed to content from China to Australia to the US and everything in between easily without necessarily noticing and without that being a problem in any sort of way for you personally. It actually offers a lot of complexity to your social identity. But what that makes really hard is understanding then how would we even begin to change norms really at a global scale to come to a point where really online violence against anyone is perceived as sort of unacceptable behavior in our global society, which would be the end goal to kind of address the root cause of online violence, at least by private individuals. So, just to kind of make this more complicated, maybe. But for me, I think the way we really approach this is that at the end of the day, to address an issue as complex and kind of pervasive as online violence, you need a coalition of actors that all do work on this topic from different angles. So we need the organizations that are really focused on kind of policy and law reform, whether that's at a national level or at an international level, because we need those institutional kind of changes to happen. And we are seeing that this can have an impact. We need the organizations that are really focused on working with the social media platforms themselves on kind of the regulation and kind of content moderation that is done by the platforms themselves. And we also need those organizations that really kind of work at the educational, social level and that work with young people, but also with older people, really. If I look at my parents' use of the internet, they are maybe more dangerous than my younger nephew sometimes. But so really on this question of working to define as a society what is a good digital citizen, which is a really hard offer, kind of a really hard question mark. And the reason I think the legal and policy change channel is sometimes not enough or kind of thinking not far enough is that you can have a great law, but then you have the next problem. And often we in civil society don't think beyond that point. We think, oh, we passed a law and now we're done. Everything is great. We have, I mean, I'm originally from Germany. We have quite strong laws in Germany and in the EU on all these topics. But if the police is not trained on how to pursue an actual police investigation into online violence, that law is not helping me. If I get, say, a death threat on my social media, and I go to the police, and the police officer that I talk to has no idea how to identify the person's IP address, how to trace who actually wrote this, where are they located, are they based in Germany or the EU? If they're based outside of the EU, is German law even applicable to this, right? And then if I actually manage to have enough evidence in that process with the police and go to a court, is that judge in my kind of district trained to rule on online violence? So just thinking on the kind of policy and law route isn't enough, because then there's all this kind of tail of other issues that we then need to take into account, which requires government reform and massive amounts of kind of training and upskilling of public servants in the police and judicial system, which makes that a really difficult and I think long-term route, just as long-term really as kind of norms change. So in the end, I think our best bet is really a mix and match. Every organization needs to focus on different ways as a solution. As I mentioned, quite a few of our interventions are really about protection rather than prevention, because prevention of violence, as I just mentioned, is so complicated. So for the moment, because it's such a crisis, most of the time, all we can do right now is help those who face online violence the most, which is usually the most vocal people, human rights defenders, journalists, politicians, and kind of thought leaders, help them protect themselves online and help them, and this is, I think, the most crucial step, help them to protect that the online violence that they face does not fall into kind of their physical life. The way I started off in this topic and kind of working on this topic was I was working on an election campaign here in Germany. And one of my jobs in that kind of in that campaign was to sort through all the hate messages we would get in a day, which were hundreds, and decide which to delete and kind of just ignore because they were just annoying, and which kind of to send forward to a lawyer for legal action. The point where this was kind of tipping was when one time our candidate came home. She was a very young woman in her kind of mid-20s at the time, came home and someone had written on her house that they knew that she lived there and that they were going to come and do despicable things to her one night. So we had to move her in the middle of the campaign. So we weren't able to properly protect her from the offline, like online violence spilling offline. And so a lot of our work right now is kind of the emergency patch, which is not going to be the long-term solution, but just helping those who are facing online violence right now protect themselves and kind of protect their own mental well-being and their physical safety. Because there's not a lot else you can do in the short term.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. Okay, questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, go.
Go ahead. It's fine, go ahead.
Okay. I was just
Can you unmute yourself and speak?
is it gonna echo? Okay.
Sorry about that.
We can hear him fine when he speaks from your
Okay, go ahead.
Oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess this can be addressed to any of the panelists, but what do you think is like the highest priority or like actionable item that should be implemented on a government or policy level to, again, like address this increase in technology facilitated gender-based violence? And then also, do you think that there needs to be more of an international and global norm setting process that needs to occur, or is it something that should be highly individualized and like localized?
Great. And if you don't mind, I'll also add Mia's question to it.
Yeah, I feel like my question specifically for Cecilia.
Yeah, that's fine.
I had a question about the survey that you mentioned, that 25% of a group of individuals who would be willing to run for political office. I was wondering, is this a specific group geographically in one location, or is this worldwide?
Perfect. And the floor is yours,
Maybe I'll
and then
just
we'll end
quickly
up
answer that one because that's an easy one. We ran it in all regions of the world. I think it was 27 countries in total. So not every country in the world, which is rather impossible, but it was a representative sample of each region. So we had a couple of countries from each region. Yeah.
Thank you. Who would like to go first with regards to our last question?
So I can start that question. Sorry, was it about the responsibility of kind of how we can address it? Does it have to be global or localized kind of approach to it? Was that
Just about what the like highest priority items are on a policy level or like from a governmental intervention perspective, and then on that, whether it should be more of an international global norm setting effort that takes place, or it's like a process that's very highly localized and specific to the nature of TFGBV in like certain regions or countries.
Yeah, so I mean, again, understanding cultural context is of course very important, and understanding local languages and the slang and everything that happens is very important when you're conducting any of these, regulatory attempts. But also, I worry a lot in my critical cybersecurity book. I think we problematize a lot the focus on the state as a source of security because, as I said, the examples that I provided, it's the state that is using these platforms to their advantage. So why would they regulate or why would they create policies that help that? I mean, there are now emerging laws. It seems like it's easier to regulate image-based abuse versus other types of abuse online. But definitely a lot of these states, like I wouldn't trust them to figure out these regulations. Private companies in Silicon Valley don't care, don't want to invest the money, don't, they use freedom of speech here in the US. They're critiquing GDPR in the EU, even though the GDPR is also problematic because it puts a lot of like pressure on individuals, like the ability to report, to do this, to understand what you can do. But if you don't have that knowledge, then that could also be problematic. A lot of these technologies are produced in the West, and it seems like I was in Ireland and my cab driver said the US innovate, the EU regulate, and what was the third one? I can't remember. And China emulates or something like that. But it is true. Like the US has been producing, there is a huge push to like advance AI, advance all these technologies without considering the slightest implication. I had a meeting with a CTO of one of the big companies, and I'm not gonna say the name, etc., because it was like an off the record meeting. And in it, the discussions were so alarming because they're producing these technologies at mass scale. Now, any coder can produce like a new AI agent, or like you can use AI agents in ways that are going to reshape our lives drastically, job markets, etc. Mind you, the disinformation and gender-based abuse. And they have no idea where we're headed. They have no clue. They said we need the governments to help us regulate. And again, which governments? That's why we definitely need an international framework, but also a way to embed in there the international context in the application or the implementation of these policies. And there are challenges at getting to that point. Companies are against it, governments are against it. So it's going to require a lot of mobilization for that to happen. Yeah.
No,
Thank you for highlighting the role of political interests in this, right? That there's sort of like competing interests. And then when it comes to human rights, obviously, like this is where things get really tricky. Yes, go ahead, Cecilia.
Yeah, maybe just to add on to this, I very much agree that a lot of hate is incredibly localized in the way it is used. So one example is we analyzed a lot of the online violence that occurred during the Mexican presidential elections last year, which of course had two women running, which was really interesting for kind of the online violence aspect. And one thing that we found, which makes kind of content moderation, if we want to look at kind of tech companies and social media platforms, how would they detect hate, right? They would scrape really the comments and try to detect hateful words or sentences. And what we found there was that a lot of comments that we flagged as hateful based on kind of the cultural context weren't hateful necessarily by the words that were used or even the sentence itself. It could be, "You're doing such a great job!" exclamation point. And then they would use specific emojis that were coded kind of culturally as like exemplifying corruption, for example. And so detecting hate online gets incredibly complicated because you have local codes like that, like specific emojis that turn a seemingly kind of neutral comment into something that is political or that is hateful. And that makes detection and regulation even harder. Maybe to add to this, which makes it really difficult to say, well, let governments or states or politicians regulate, is apart from the argument that was already made on, well, which states and with what motive, is a question of capacity of public servants and politicians, right? Do we actually have people who understand AI? The EU developed its AI policy. They started working on their kind of digital policy in 2013, 2014. They parsed it 2 years ago. By now, everything that they were regulating is horrendously out of date. We're talking about platforms that no longer are relevant for kind of the young generation or kind of us as a society. So pushing everything on regulation means hoping for a process that is by design relatively slow and is done by people who also need to learn what is an AI, who are not usually experts in AI kind of development and design and technology, who are not studying computer science or anything like that, but who come usually from a legal background or from a political science background. And for them to understand, what do I actually have to regulate? How do I do it quickly and efficiently in a way that doesn't create kind of a massive bureaucratic kind of problem that then doesn't actually serve the purpose, is a very hard task, which is why really policy advocacy in this topic is really difficult. What do you advocate for? Who do you advocate towards? One maybe visual I do want to give is when we think about safety in other kind of technology areas. I mean, say cars, right? Cars were quite unsafe, and the companies that developed the car are not the same companies that then developed the car seat for children, which now saves lives of children every single day. So why are we expecting for social media platforms and technology and AI companies that the companies creating the kind of cost model that they want to profit off of, the platform itself, that they are also the same company that now builds in the safety and the regulation, which is one reason why we really like to work with lots of different tech startups that try to do exactly that and that try to kind of innovate and plug into existing platforms to make them safe and like easier to use, rather than hoping that kind of the Metas and Twitters and Googles of this world will see reason and start kind of en masse regulating and moderating online. How about we look at the innovations that are already happening that can actually help us make the internet a safer and better place? Because that's where the innovation is going to happen and that's where the solution is coming from. So I wouldn't look at the state. I probably also wouldn't necessarily look at the international order right now to provide the solution. So my hope is in the young kind of innovators and the tech people who will find the innovative solutions, as we have in other kind of areas as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And that is such a good note to end on in the terms of also highlighting sort of the opportunity that we have. So our course, as I said, is sort of very much leans into sort of feminist thought and feminist practice. And, if you want to have gender equality and if you want to have harm recognition and harm prevention, there's a lot that the literature gives us. And just because, big tech is like, hostile to that, or even particularly our states and our governments are hostile to that, then obviously, yeah, that doesn't mean that it's the end of it. Thank you so much, both of you. This has been fantastic. Homa, do you want to say one second thing? Because I know for Cecilia, it's pretty late.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very informative. I mean, as you were talking, I started reflecting on when we were working on violence against women, what were the strategies we used, and how can we bring those experiences into the digital world. So thank you. I mean, both of you have opened up quite a new areas, but quite important for young women who want to enter into politics, especially in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that analogy as well, that like there's a lot of accomplishments that took place on the violence against women sphere. And it took decades into making. Obviously, feminist scholars, feminist practitioners were sort of at the forefront of that. Now we're seeing yeah, a renewal of that. And there were these questions of, does the culture play a role? Does, what is the, how do you do norm diffusion and so on and so forth, right? So I think those same similarities are really important. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you. I will be in touch with both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night. Bye.